Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and your job is to draw the image that you see. We'll have an artist giving a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It's entirely up to you. Many people choose to watch these videos twice. The first time round they just watch them, and then the second time round they watch them and draw along. Once you've finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber portrait drawing session. Now this is a Halloween themed session and I will be drawing a 1-hour pose using willow charcoal, a grey putty rubber, and finally, I will be using a blending tool. Now in my case, this will be a hook brush, but you can also use your fingers or a stump or even a piece of tissue. So let's get started with the drawing. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure I hold my willow charcoal at the very end and make sure I use a light touch. And this helps with erasing later on. And the first thing I'm going to do is draw the top of the pose and the bottom of the chin. Another useful line is the center line, and this is the line that goes all the way from the top of the forehead down to the middle of the nose and the chin. Now the benefit of using a light touch like that is that you can erase really easily. So for instance, I think that I've got a bit too much space at the bottom of the page, so I can just erase my bottom line and place it a bit lower. Another thing that I'm going to use is comparative measurements. And this basically means that you're comparing various parts of the drawing to other parts. And a very obvious and easy example of this is the midpoint. I can simply lay my charcoal over the drawing, find the midpoint, and then mark it down. I'm using my thumb here to indicate where that midpoint should be. In the photograph, the midpoint is the top of the brow, going from the bottom of the skull to the top of the skull. So I can use this measurement to make sure that this brow line is also in the middle of my drawing. I can also use this same measurement tool or measurement system to compare the height versus the width of the drawing. So looking at the brow to the chin and laying my pencil across or my charcoal across, I can then turn it 90 degrees and compare that to the width of the skull around the cheekbones. And I see that they're roughly the same width. So generally when using this comparative measurement system, I tend to look for quarters, thirds or halves. And conveniently in this pose, quarters are really useful because I can see that the bottom of the nose is located on 1/4 and the top of the hairline is located at the top quarter. So this way I can easily check if things are in the right place, and I can check vertical measurements but also horizontal measurements. Next thing I'm going to do is look at angles. Going from that widest point of the skull, which are cheekbones, I can see that it narrows down towards the chin. And what really helps me find these angles is imagining a clock. So for instance, comparing the angle on the left hand side to the vertical, which would be 12 or 6 o'clock, we can see it's aiming more towards 5 o'clock. Same thing on the other side, but of course it wouldn't be 5 o'clock, it would be more like 7 o'clock. And I find this system of looking at angles this way really, really useful, because it allows me to see things in an objective way rather than how I think they should be. Now the natural instinct here is to use lines, and I want to go against that natural instinct and instead use tones to draw. So instead of leaving the line as it is, I can see that the veil behind is a lot darker than her skin. So I'm going to use this as a dark shape to indicate that line. And the reason why I do this is because it's actually a lot more realistic to the way we see. As the Impressionists found out, all we really see is spots of color and tone on our retina. And our brain then constructs this into lines and other things. So I'm going to try and draw this just using dark and light tones. For instance, a good example of this is this logo, and we all obviously know it. But as you can see, there are no lines, they're just black and white shapes, and that's what we're going to try and do in this drawing. So again, same on the other side, we can see that the veil behind her chin is a little bit darker, so I'm going to use a dark tone there. And then feel free to blend this in if you've got a blending tool. Now again, looking at angles, going up from the cheekbones, following her hairline, we can see that's pretty much 12 o'clock or vertical. So again, I'm going to put these lines down, make sure they're symmetrical, and then use tone to indicate the dark hair and the veil. And at this point, try to only use one dark tone. Later on, we will be using more different values and tones, but for now, let's try to keep things simple and just use light tones and dark tones, just like in the Panda logo. So now I've got the rough head shape in, got the hairline and the veil, and I can start putting in the features. I'm going to start with the chin area and work my way up. So first looking at where the mouth is located, and I can see that the corners of the mouth are located roughly halfway between the nose and the bottom of the chin. And this is also the area where I see the chin starting to get a bit more narrow. So I'm just going to fill that in. So as you can see, I am really only using a line to indicate a measurement and then straight away jumping into drawing using tones. So another example of this is the ears. First, I can indicate the measurements of the ear just above that brow line and above the nose. And then I can just use my rubber to cut into the dark shapes that I've made. And this is the reason why it's extra important to be very light-handed at the start, because you want to be able to erase into the dark shapes that you've made before. Now from here I can start looking at the brow line, and I've measured it as the midpoint, so that's where I'm going to start. And I see that the brow curves about 2/3 into the eye socket. And again, instead of drawing a line, I'm going to start by drawing a shape here. And make sure that with a pose like this, you keep everything as symmetrical as possible. So once I've got one eye in, I use it as a template and a guideline to find the other eye. Now for the eyes themselves, it can be very tempting to start rendering and already drawing the dark shapes of the iris and so on. But instead I'm just going to use a light tone to indicate the whole eyeball, and I will render this more later. Feel free to correct anything that you've done before if you see it needs some changing. So I'm always looking at improving my drawing and improving what I've already got, rather than adding more detail necessarily. So next I've got the nose. Because the light's coming from the bottom here, the whole top of the nose is in shadow. So I'm just going to sketch out that shape, trying to keep it simple and quite blocky at the start, knowing that later I can start erasing into this. And once you've got this shape in, feel free to start refining this and looking for the smaller shapes on top. But try to hold back on completely rendering it at the start. You want to keep fairly flexible so you can still make changes in the drawing. Now while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all about this or any other part of the drawing, feel free to ask me in the comments if you're watching this live. Okay, so now I've got a blocky representation of the eyes as well as the nose. I can start working on the mouth. And what I like to do to find the corners of the mouth is drop a vertical line down the middle of the eye. This helps me find and locate those corners. Keep in mind that the light is coming from the bottom, therefore the top lid will actually be quite illuminated and the bottom lip will be a bit darker. Now she does have dark makeup on, but I'm just ignoring this for the moment and just looking at that dark shape of the bottom lip and the lighter shape of the top lip. And if you want, you can even already start adding the blood stains on the sides of the corners of her mouth. But still try to keep things fairly simple for this phase of the drawing and try not to start rendering too much just yet. Now try not to get confused by local colors, and this means that, of course, we can see the blood is red, her lips are slight pink, and they can feel confusing because, of course, you're drawing in black and white. But really try to force yourself to just draw dark shapes and light shapes for now, to keep the drawing quite easy so you can still be very flexible and move things around. There are also a fair few local colors on her face. For instance, the top of her lip and the bottom of her nose is a little bit darker. And you can draw this in, but it's very easy to then get this confused with the darkest shapes. For instance, the top of the nostrils is very dark compared to the top of the lip. So I tend to leave this out until the very last moment in the drawing. So now I've got the block-in done, and this means that I've blocked in all of the big masses of dark and light, and I've got the features placed, and all of my big proportions are in, so I can start rendering a bit more. So what I'm going to do is take the shapes that I already have and start refining them. So for instance, starting with the eyes, I can see that the brow just about touches the dark shape of her eyeshadow, and that her eyes are almond shaped. And again, I'm not really looking at what is there, as in it's an eye or it is an eyeball. Instead, I'm just looking at this squarish shape with an angular shape of the brow above it, trying to really make it abstract in my mind. And this can actually really help with making things more accurate. Because everyone can draw a square, but not everyone can draw an eye. But if you draw enough squares in the right places, an eye will start to appear. So that's what we're trying to do in this phase of the drawing. So same thing for the nostrils, adding the small square shapes on the sides there. Just constantly correcting the drawing. And again, if you have any questions about this or anything else, feel free to let me know in the comments. But also drawing in the larger shapes. So for instance, the roses on top of the veil are really just big blobs of dark shapes with some lighter shapes on top. So I'm just going to draw these dark shapes in. Later I can start cutting in with my rubber to create the leaves on the roses. And this way of working is actually very similar to the way I paint. And those of you who've got a gold subscription may have seen some of my Alla Prima portrait videos, in which I do this same technique, but just with raw umber instead of charcoal, for instance. So it's a very versatile way of drawing. Another really good example of this is the collar. Now it is white fabric, but actually most of the top of the collar is in shadow. So even though it is a white fabric, I'm just going to treat it as a shadow shape, flattening it with the brush. And then finally taking a rubber and simply cutting into that shadow shape to create the light highlights. And this can actually create a lot of texture and information in a drawing without using more than 1 or 2 tones. And just before we start working on a larger arrangement of tone, try to see if there's other places that you can erase into. For instance, I can see some highlights near the hair there. So up till now, we've really only worked with these 2 shades, the flattened and light charcoal shade and the white of the paper. And what I'm going to do now is add more tones to this arrangement. On the dark side, on the shadow side, I will add a darker tone. And on the light side, I can just add a slightly darker tone, making sure it's still lighter than anything in the shadows. It's really important to keep that division between lights and shadows really clear to make sure that the drawing doesn't feel confusing to the viewer. So let's start with the eye. I could start erasing into the eyeball, but instead what I'm going to do is start adding darker accents. For instance, for the iris. And try to connect your dark shapes up together. For instance, I see the top of the iris connects up with the top lid and the makeup on the top of the lid. As well as the eyeliner at the bottom of the lid. Only if I've put these darker accents into the shadows and I still feel like there's not quite enough contrast, then I may go in with the eraser. But I try to always push the darks first. Same thing with the other eye. First adding in the iris. Then connecting that dark shape with other dark shapes surrounding it. And finally cutting in with the razor to create highlights. And note again that all of my lights and all of my darks are connected. There's not lots of small dark shapes or small light shapes. And this enhances the strength of the drawing and makes it feel like there's more contrast going on and it feels more cohesive. So now I've added some darker accents into the darks. I may add some darker accents into the lights as well, but always making sure that these are lighter than the lightest area of the darks. So the lights and the darks should never cross over. So I'm just going to work my way down here, looking at smaller shapes of darkness in the nose and later on also in the lips. And of course, while I'm doing this and you've got any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. When drawing the mouth, imagine that the corners of the mouth are always deeper than the middle of the mouth, because the mouth is this sort of horseshoe shape. It sticks out in the middle and turns around with the rest of the face as it gets to the wider ends. So always make sure that I use my dark accents into the corners of the mouth and not the middle, to enhance that feeling of the mouth turning round the face. So I've done the small shapes in the features, but of course the elephant in the room is that the hair and the veil are almost black. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time darkening the whole background of the veil. And what I tend to do here is really work it into the paper. So go over with my charcoal, then blend it in using my blending tool, and then go over it again to really build up those tones. And the darker I can go with my shadows, my darks, the more contrast my picture will have, and therefore the more visual impact it will have as well. So I'm always trying to push these darks darker, especially if I'm working on white paper. And feel free to already start looking at some shapes in the hair, looking for the darker areas as well as the lighter areas. Keep an eye out for the lighter darks. So for instance, the color is actually a shadow, but it's also a lighter shadow because it is a white fabric. So I'm not going to go all the way to black in that area. So now I've got most of my darks in, I can start looking at the flowers on top of the veil. And again, I'm keeping it simple here, just taking my rubber and just erasing into those round shadow shapes that I put down earlier to indicate the light falling on the leaves of the roses. You don't have to be very accurate with this. The main thing is that the center of the rose will be more tightly wound, whereas the leaves towards the edges of the rose will be bigger, and therefore the light shapes will also be bigger. As you can see, having just these light and dark shapes can actually give a lot of visual impact. So with drawing, as with many things, less is more. So I'm always trying to do as much as I can with as little information as possible. So for instance, the forehead is actually quite dark, but I'm not wanting to confuse this with the darkness of the hair. So I'm just going to give this a very light glaze with my charcoal, constantly being aware of that boundary between light and shadow, and then blending that in. Now at this stage, I'm not going to introduce more tones because I also think we're near the end of the pose and you don't want to start changing the whole drawing. So instead what I'm going to focus on is refining and edges. And what I mean by edges is really how two tones blend into each other. Sometimes one tone blends into the other very smoothly, and sometimes the gradation is not very clear at all. And instead you have a very clear shape. So for instance, the highlight in the corners of the eye here. So this stage is all about blending. If you need to blend the very lightest tones into each other, I find a makeup sponge really useful because it gives a very soft blend. On the other hand, if you want to give more definition to the darks, at this point a line is actually quite useful. So just surrounding your dark shapes with a gentle line can really give them some definition and focus. And this brings me to the concept of the focal point. And it's the last thing that I will speak about in this video. Have a look at this graphic made by Charlie Pickard. On the left we've got an original sergeant, and on the right we've got a sergeant that's got dark and light contrast all over the face. And you can see that on the left hand side the face looks much more realistic and has a lot better focus on the features. And this is because all of the detail is put into the features and not in the surrounding skin. And this is the same thing that I try to keep in mind when drawing my own portraits. I tend to look at what I want to express, and I try to put the focus in that area. In this case, for me the most striking area of this drawing or this photograph are the eyes. So I'm going to put all of my detail and all of my value range or tonal range in that area, and I'm going to keep everything else a little bit softer, with slightly softer tones and less detail. So for the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to continue rendering this portrait. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know in the comments if you're watching this live, and otherwise I will speak to you at the end of the pose. As a final note, if you feel like you're already done with the portrait and you'd like to show it here in the chat, we do have a photo option, so feel free to show off your artwork. Alright, so that's the end of the post. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you feel like you've learned something. If you use Instagram, feel free to use the hashtag #RawUmberLive. And I hope to see you at another video.
Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. Goodbye. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 p.m. You can find out more details on our website, rawumberstudios.com.